The winter of 1962 carved Denver with a blade sharper than any the city had seen in decades. Snow didn't fall, it attacked, whipping through the alleyways behind Morrison Street like broken glass, coating everything in a silence so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself. The temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in 3 weeks, and the wind carried the kind of cold that settled into your bones and made a home there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the narrow space between Kowalski's Meat Market and the abandoned Murphy's Shoe Repair, where the dumpsters created a fortress of rusted metal and forgotten dreams, a girl crouched in the shadows. Her name was Lily Chun, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in so long she sometimes wondered if she'd imagined having one at all. 17 years old, though the streets had aged her in ways that numbers couldn't measure. Her jacket, if the torn, grease-stained fabric could still be called, that had once been blue. Now it was the color of everything she'd touched, slept on, or hidden behind, ground, like the city itself. The sleeves ended 3 inches above her wrists, and the zipper had given up months ago. Underneath, a sweater with holes large enough to frame her ribs, which pressed against her skin like prison bars. The hunger had become something alive inside her, a creature with teeth and claws that gnawed at her stomach lining and whispered promises of food that never came. She'd learned to bargain with it, to make deals. If she could find half a sandwich today, she'd ignore the cramping tomorrow. If she could swallow enough melted snow, maybe the gnawing would quiet for an hour. But tonight, the creature was winning. Lily pressed her back against the brick wall, feeling the cold seep through the thin layers of clothing like water through a sieve. Her breath came in short puffs that disappeared almost instantly, as if the air itself was too cold to hold them. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to conserve what little warmth her body still produced, and listened. The sound came from beyond the dumpsters, a low, rumbling growl that spoke of territories marked and challenges issued. Dogs, 3 of them, maybe 4, moving with the careful precision of survivors who'd learned that every meal might be their last. She'd seen them before, this pack that roamed the industrial district after dark, picking through the refuse of businesses that threw away more in a day than she'd eaten in a week. Lily knew their schedule now. They came to Morrison Street every Tuesday and Friday, just after the meat market closed, when Old Man Kowalski would toss the bones and scraps that couldn't be sold into the alley. The dogs had claimed this territory months ago, marking it with scent and ceremony, establishing a hierarchy that Lily had studied from a distance like a scholar learning a foreign language. Tonight was Friday. Tonight there would be scraps. She waited until the sounds grew closer, then closer still, until she could hear individual paws crunching through the snow. The pack leader, a German shepherd mix with scarred ears and eyes like amber stones, appeared first, nose to the ground, reading the story that the alley told in smells and traces. Behind him came a smaller dog, some kind of terrier blend with a limp that spoke of old injuries, and then 2 others whose breeds had been blurred by generations of street mixing. They moved with purpose, checking corners, sniffing for changes in their domain. Lily held her breath, pressing deeper into the shadows, becoming part of the wall itself. She'd learned this art of invisibility over the months of living between spaces, of existing in the gaps that most people never noticed. The dogs reached the dumpster behind the meat market and began their ritual. Investigation. The leader circled twice before approaching, establishing his authority over the territory and everything in it. The smaller dogs waited, knowing their place in the order of things, understanding that survival meant respecting the hierarchy, even when hunger made your stomach feel like it was eating itself from the inside. Lily watched them work, tearing into bags with practiced efficiency, separating the valuable from the worthless with an expertise born of necessity. A piece of gristle here, a bone with marrow there, scraps of fat that had been trimmed from cuts destined for paying customers. The dogs ate with the focused intensity of creatures who knew that every meal was a victory against the odds. She waited until they'd had their fill, until the leader had claimed his portion and the others had taken what the hierarchy allowed. Only then, when they'd begun to move on to other territories, other opportunities, did she make her move. The snow crunched under her feet despite her attempts at stealth. The sound was small, barely audible over the wind, but in the urban wilderness, where survival depended on noticing everything, it might as well have been a gunshot. The pack leader's head snapped up, eyes scanning the shadows with the intensity of a predator who'd learned that threats came from unexpected directions. Lily froze, every muscle in her body rigid with the kind of fear that comes from knowing you've crossed a line you can't uncross. The dog's gaze found her, amber eyes reflecting the distant streetlight like twin flames. For a moment, they stared at each other across the alley, predator and scavenger, both creatures of the margins, both fighting the same war against hunger. And cold. The dog's lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that had been sharpened by necessity and survival. Not quite a snarl, not quite a warning, but something that spoke of boundaries and consequences. The other dogs had noticed now. Forming a loose semicircle, their body language shifting from feeding to defending. Lily raised her hands slowly, the universal gesture of submission that transcended species. She'd learned this language too, the careful choreography of avoiding conflict when conflict meant death. But even as she tried to project harmlessness, her eyes remained fixed on the scattered remains near the dumpster. A piece of meat, maybe 2 inches long, had fallen from one of the bags. Fat marbled through the red, and despite the cold, she could smell the richness of it, the promise of calories and protein, and the kind of satisfaction she'd almost forgotten existed. The pack leader stepped between her and the dumpster, making his position clear. This was his territory, his food, his rules. The smaller dogs flanked him, understanding their role in the pack dynamic without needing instruction. They'd done this before, established dominance over other scavengers, other desperate creatures, who dared to challenge their claim. But Lily hadn't eaten in 3 days. The hunger creature inside her had grown beyond the point where fear could control it, beyond the point where rational thought could negotiate with desperate need. She took a step forward, then another, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who'd calculated the odds and decided that the risk was worth the potential reward. The growling started low, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The pack leader's stance shifted, weight moving to his front paws, preparing for the kind of confrontation that would be brief and decisive. But Lily didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The piece of meat was 6 feet away, then 5, then 4. Attack came without warning, the way violence always did in the spaces between civilization. The leader lunged, not to kill but to establish dominance, to remind this intruder that survival had rules and breaking them had consequences. Lily threw herself sideways, hitting the snow hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. The dog's jaws snapped shut inches from her face, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath and smell the metallic scent of blood on his teeth. She rolled, instinct taking over from conscious thought, and her hand closed around something cold and hard. A piece of bone, thick enough to serve as a club, long enough to keep the dogs at a distance. She swung it in a wide arc, not trying to hurt them, but to create space, to buy herself the seconds she needed to reach the meat. Dogs circled her now, their formation tight and coordinated. They'd done this before too, dealt with desperate humans who'd forgotten their place in the urban food chain. The leader feinted left, then right, testing her reflexes, looking for the opening that would end the confrontation quickly. Lily's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats, the distance between herself and the scrap of meat that represented the difference between surviving another day and becoming just another casualty of the streets. She feinted toward the smaller dog, then spun and dove for the dumpster, her fingers closing around the piece of fat marbled meat, just as teeth sank into the fabric of her jacket. The cloth tore with a sound like breaking promises, and she stumbled forward, clutching the meat to her chest like a talisman. The dogs pursued, but their formation had broken, their hierarchy disrupted by the unexpected desperation of their opponent. She scrambled up onto the dumpster's edge, then dropped down the other side, putting the metal barrier between herself and the pack. The meat was cold against her palm, slick with grease and snow. She bit into it without hesitation, tearing chunks with teeth that had learned to be efficient when opportunities were rare. The taste exploded across her tongue, salt and fat and the iron richness of blood, flavor so intense after days of emptiness that they made her dizzy. She chewed quickly, swallowing pieces that were too large, driven by the knowledge that the dogs were still out there, still hunting, still angry about the theft from their territory. The protein hit her system like a drug, sending warmth through her limbs and clarity to her thoughts. For the first time in days, the hunger creature quieted, satisfied enough to let her think beyond the immediate need for calories. She pressed her back against the dumpster and allowed herself a moment of victory, small and temporary though it might be. The dogs had moved on, their growls fading as they continued their patrol of the neighborhood. They'd remember this encounter, mark her as a threat to their territory, but for now, she was safe. She'd won this battle, claimed her share of the city's discarded abundance, proven that she could survive another day in the spaces between mercy and starvation. But even as she savored the taste of fat and meat, Lily knew that tomorrow would bring the same desperate calculation, the same choice between dignity and survival. The city was full of territories like this one, claimed by creatures who'd learned that sharing meant dying, that compassion was a luxury that only the well-fed could afford. She finished eating and wiped her hands on her jacket, leaving dark stains on fabric that had already absorbed the evidence of 100 similar victories and defeats. The snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny reminder that winter was far from over, that the hardest months still lay ahead. Lily pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and prepared to move on, to find another doorway, another alley, another space where she could wait out the night and begin the cycle again. Behind her, the dogs' territory returned to silence, marked only by the scattered remains of their feast and the memory of a girl who'd been desperate enough to fight for scraps. The hunger creature stirred in her stomach, temporarily satisfied, but already planning tomorrow's campaign. She'd learned to think like the dogs now, to calculate territory and hierarchy, to understand that survival meant becoming something harder than the world that tried to break you. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in the long winter of 1962. Lily Chun counted the strikes and started walking, her footsteps joining the symphony of night sounds that belonged to those who lived in the margins, who found sustenance in the spaces between plenty and want. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Sullivan had been training dogs for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like what he witnessed that Friday night behind Morrison Street. From his position in the cab of his pickup truck, parked at the mouth of the alley while he waited for his escaped German shepherd to return, he watched a scene that would replay in his mind for weeks afterward. The girl moved like smoke through the shadows, her body language speaking fluent desperation. She understood pack dynamics better than most of his paying clients, reading the dog's territorial signals with an accuracy that came from necessity rather than education. When she made her move toward the scraps, Marcus found himself leaning forward, unconsciously holding his breath as the confrontation unfolded. He'd come to this part of town tracking Rex, a 2-year-old shepherd who'd bolted during a training session at Washington Park. The dog had a history of wandering, drawn by scents and sounds that spoke to instincts older than domestication. Marcus had followed the trail through 3 neighborhoods, asking questions and following leads. until someone at a gas station mentioned seeing a large dog heading toward the industrial district. Now, Rex sat in the passenger seat beside him, panting softly, completely unaware that his escape had led Marcus to witness something that would change everything. The girl had vanished into the maze of back alleys, leaving only footprints in the snow and the memory of her desperate courage. Marcus sat in the truck for 20 minutes after she disappeared, trying to process what he'd seen. Training dogs had taught him to read behavior, to understand the language of survival that all creatures spoke when pushed to their limits. The girl's movements had been those of someone who'd learned to navigate danger with the same precision his best-trained animals displayed. She hadn't panicked when confronted by the pack. Instead, she'd calculated, adapted, and overcome. Marcus drove home to his small ranch on the outskirts of Lakewood, but sleep proved elusive. He kept seeing the girl's face in the moment she'd bitten into that scrap of meat, not just hungry, but hollow, as if she'd been carved out from the inside. He'd worked with rescue animals who carried that same emptiness, creatures who'd forgotten what safety felt like, who approached every kindness with suspicion born from experience. The next morning brought a call from Janet Morrison, who owned the boarding kennels on Alameda Avenue. 3 of her dogs had gotten loose during the night, and she needed help tracking them down before they caused trouble in the neighborhood. Marcus loaded his equipment and drove into the city, but his mind remained fixed on the alley behind Morrison Street. He found Janet's dogs. Within 2 hours, 2 had taken shelter under a loading dock 6 blocks away, while the third had been picked up by animal control and was waiting at the municipal shelter. As he returned the last escapee to the kennels, Janet mentioned something that made his stomach tighten. "Strangest thing," she said, securing the gate behind the recovered Labrador. "Thompson from the meat market called this morning. Says he's been losing inventory from his dumpster. Not just animals getting into it, but someone systematically going through the bags. He's thinking about putting up cameras." Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. The girl was still out there, still fighting for scraps, still calculating the odds between starvation and confrontation every time she needed to eat. The thought of her being caught on camera, possibly arrested for scavenging, made something twist in his chest. He spent the afternoon at his ranch, working with a border collie whose owners wanted to train it for sheep herding. The dog was intelligent, eager to please, quick to learn the commands that would give structure to its natural instincts. But even as Marcus guided the animal through its paces, part of his attention remained focused on a problem that had nothing to do with training. The ranch sat on 12 acres of rolling prairie, surrounded by neighbors who kept horses and raised cattle on a small scale. Marcus had built it slowly over the years, starting with a modest house and expanding as his reputation grew. The kennels were state-of-the-art, designed for comfort and safety. The training fields provided space for dogs to run and learn without the constraints of city living. He'd never wanted for much. The business provided enough income to maintain the property and keep food on the table. He lived alone by choice, finding companionship in the animals he worked with and satisfaction in the progress they made under his guidance. But tonight, standing in his warm kitchen and preparing dinner for himself and the dogs, he couldn't shake the image of someone fighting for scraps in an alley. Marcus had grown up in foster care, moving between homes that ranged from indifferent to cruel. He understood hunger, not just the physical sensation, but the way it changed your thinking, made you consider options that would have been unthinkable when your stomach was full. He'd learned early that kindness was rare and usually came with conditions. That survival meant developing instincts that civilization tried to train out of people. The dogs had saved him, in a way. His first real foster family had owned a kennel, and Marcus had discovered that animals responded to authenticity in ways that humans often didn't. Dogs didn't care about your past or your potential. They cared about consistency, fairness, and the kind of patient communication that built trust rather than demanded it. He'd started training professionally at 22, working for other people's businesses before eventually saving enough to buy his own land. The work satisfied something deep in him, the process of taking creatures who'd been shaped by fear or confusion and helping them find structure, purpose, confidence. But he'd never encountered a human who needed the same kind of patient rehabilitation. Sunday. Morning brought snow again, lighter this time but persistent enough to cover the tracks from the previous night's adventures. Marcus fed the dogs in his care, checked the heating systems in the kennels, and tried to convince himself that going back to Morrison Street was a waste of time. The girl could be anywhere in the city by now. She might not even return to that particular territory. The dogs could have established new patterns, found different food sources, but by afternoon, he was loading a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches into his truck. The alley looked different, in daylight smaller, more ordinary, less like the stage for survival dramas and more like the forgotten space behind businesses that closed at 5 o'clock. The dumpsters that had seemed like fortress walls in the darkness now revealed themselves as simple containers, dented and stained but unremarkable. The snow had covered most of the evidence from Friday night's encounter, leaving only smooth white surfaces that told no stories. Marcus parked where he'd been before and waited. He wasn't sure what he expected to accomplish, wasn't even certain the girl would return. But something about the precision of her movements, the calculated way she'd approached the confrontation with the pack, suggested someone who operated on patterns, who'd learned to find safety in routine, even when that routine involved risk. The hours passed slowly. He watched pedestrians hurry past the mouth of the alley, bundled against the cold and focused on destinations that promised warmth and shelter. A few homeless individuals appeared and disappeared, checking the dumpsters with the casual efficiency of people who knew the schedules of garbage pickup and delivery. None of them was the girl he'd seen fighting dogs for meat. As evening approached, Marcus began to question his judgment. The rational part of his mind pointed out that he was sitting in an alley in the industrial district, waiting for someone who might not exist in the way he remembered. Memory could be unreliable, especially memory of dramatic events witnessed in poor lighting. Maybe the girl had been older than he thought, or younger, or hadn't been fighting dogs at all, but simply scavenging in parallel with them. Then he heard the growling. The pack appeared at the far end of the alley, moving with the same territorial confidence he remembered from Friday night. 4 dogs this time, the German Shepherd mix still in the lead, the others following in an order that spoke of established hierarchy. They moved through their ritual investigation with practiced efficiency, checking corners and reading scent markers that told them who'd been in their territory. And when Marcus watched them approach the meat market's dumpster, noting the way they communicated through body language and positioning, the leader's ears swiveled constantly, monitoring for threats or opportunities. The smaller dogs maintained respectful distances while staying close enough to respond to signals. They'd learned to work as a unit, maximizing their chances of survival. Through cooperation, the girl appeared 20 minutes later, materializing from shadows that Marcus would have sworn were empty moments before. She wore the same torn jacket, the same careful posture of someone who'd learned to move without drawing attention. But tonight she carried something in her left hand, a length of pipe or metal rod that caught the streetlight as she shifted position. She'd adapted her strategy based on the previous encounter, armed herself with a tool that would give her better odds in a confrontation. Marcus found himself impressed despite the circumstances. The girl was learning, evolving her tactics based on experience. She approached survival the way his best students approached training, with intelligence, patience, and the willingness to modify behavior based on results. The confrontation unfolded differently this time. The dogs had learned too, recognizing her scent and remembering the challenge she'd posed to their authority. They formed their defensive formation more quickly, communicating through subtle signals that spoke of shared memory and coordinated response. But the girl had anticipated this. She approached from a different angle, using the geometry of the alley to limit the pack's ability to surround her. What followed was a careful dance of threat and counter-threat, advance and retreat. The girl wasn't trying to dominate the pack. She understood that was impossible. Instead, she was negotiating, using body language and positioning to communicate that she posed no permanent threat to their territory, that she simply needed access to resources they weren't using. Marcus watched her back down when the pack leader asserted dominance, then advance again when his attention shifted to maintaining order among the other dogs. She was reading the dynamics in real time, adjusting her behavior based on the pack's responses. When she finally made her move toward the scattered scraps, it was with the precision of someone who'd calculated every variable. The dogs allowed it, not because they'd accepted her as part of their pack, but because she'd demonstrated that she understood the rules, that she could operate within their system without disrupting it. She took only what she needed, leaving the majority of the available food for the pack. It was a tribute system, a way of maintaining access to the territory without claiming ownership of it. Marcus sat in his truck, watching this negotiation between species, and realized he was witnessing something remarkable. The girl had developed a working relationship with wild animals based on mutual respect and clear communication. She'd found a way to survive that didn't depend on charity or institutions or the variable kindness of humans. She'd created her own solution to an impossible problem. But even as he admired her resourcefulness, Marcus could see the cost it was taking. She moved with the careful precision of someone in constant pain, favoring her left side in a way that suggested injury or chronic hunger. Her face, when it caught the light, showed the hollow-cheeked gauntness of malnutrition. She was surviving, but barely, and winter was far from over. As she prepared to leave the alley, clutching her small victory against the cold, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives. He opened the truck door and stepped into the snow, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. The girl spun toward him, every muscle tensing for flight, the metal rod rising to defensive position. "Easy," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used with frightened animals. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." The metal rod trembled in Lily's grip, reflecting the streetlight in fractured patterns across the snow. She calculated distances with the speed of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant death. 15 feet to the alley's mouth, 20 to the fire escape ladder on the building side, 30 to the maze of loading docks where she could disappear. Into shadows the stranger couldn't navigate. Marcus remained motionless, recognizing the signs of an animal preparing for flight. Every line of the girl's body spoke of coiled energy ready to explode into motion. Her breathing had shifted to the shallow, rapid rhythm that preceded either fight or flight, and her eyes darted between his face and the escape routes she'd already mapped. "My name is Marcus," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I train dogs for a living. I've been watching you work with that pack, and I've never seen anything like it." The compliment didn't relax her. If anything, it made her more suspicious. Lily had learned that praise from strangers usually came with hooks attached, that admiration was often the first step in someone's attempt to extract something from you. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, preparing to run. "You understand them," Marcus continued, ignoring the way she flinched at his words. "The way you read their signals, the way you negotiated for access to their territory, that's not something you can teach. That's instinct. What do you want?" The words came out as a rasp, her voice damaged by cold and disuse. She hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks, and the sound of her own voice seemed foreign in the winter air. Marcus slowly reached into his jacket pocket, moving with the deliberate care of someone approaching a wounded animal. Lily's grip tightened on the way. Metal rod, but she didn't flee. Something in his posture, the absence of aggression, the respectful distance he maintained spoke a language She'd learned to trust more than words. He withdrew a wrapped sandwich and placed it on the ground between them, then stepped back to his original position. "I want to offer you something better than fighting dogs for scraps." Lily stared at the sandwich as if it might transform into something dangerous. Food offered freely was rare in her world, and rarity bred suspicion. She'd learned to examine gifts for hidden costs, to calculate what the giver might expect in return. The sandwich sat in the snow like a test, waiting for her to reveal whether hunger could override caution. "There's no catch," Marcus said, reading her hesitation. "You're hungry. I have food." That's the beginning and end of it. But nothing was ever that simple, and Lily knew it. She studied his face in the dim light, looking for the telltale signs of predators she'd learned to recognize: the too bright smile, the calculating eyes, the body language that spoke of ownership rather than offering. Marcus displayed none of these markers. His stance remained open, non-threatening, his hands visible and empty now that he'd delivered the sandwich. "I saw what you did with those dogs," he said after the silence stretched between them. "You didn't try to dominate them or drive them away. You found a way to coexist, to work within their system. That takes intelligence and patience. It takes understanding." Lily crouched slowly, keeping her eyes on Marcus while her free hand reached for the sandwich. The bread was soft, real bread rather than the stale crusts she'd grown accustomed to. Through the wrapping, she could feel the thickness of meat and cheese, layers of nutrition that represented more calories than she'd consumed in the past 3 days combined. She unwrapped one corner and bit into it without standing, ready to run if Marcus moved closer. The flavors hit her system like a shock ham and Swiss cheese, lettuce and tomato, mustard that carried a sharpness her dulled taste buds had forgotten existed. She chewed slowly, forcing herself not to devour the sandwich in desperate gulps. That might make her sick. "I run a training facility outside the city," Marcus said, watching her eat. "Dogs come to me when their owners can't handle them anymore, when they've developed behaviors that make them difficult to live with. I teach them to trust again, to function in the human world without losing what makes them who they are." Lily paused in her chewing, studying him with new wariness. The comparison was obvious, and she didn't appreciate being categorized as another creature in need of training. The metal rod shifted in her grip, reminding Marcus that she was armed and still prepared to defend herself. "I'm not saying you need training," he clarified quickly. "I'm saying you have skills that most people spend years trying to develop. You understand animal behavior better than clients who pay me hundreds of dollars for sessions. You've survived on the streets through intelligence and adaptation. Those are rare qualities." The sandwich was half gone now, and with nutrition came clearer thinking. Lily found herself analyzing Marcus's approach with the same attention she'd given to the dog pack's hierarchy. He wasn't pushing for immediate trust or demanding information she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he was establishing credentials, demonstrating value, creating a foundation for potential cooperation. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked, finishing the last bite and immediately missing the weight of food in her stomach. Marcus reached into his truck and withdrew a thermos, unscrewing the cap and pouring steaming coffee into the metal cup. The smell of it carried across the cold air, rich and warm and promising. He set the cup next to where the sandwich had been and stepped back again. "Work," he said simply. "I need someone who understands animals, who can read their signals and respond appropriately. Most of my assistants are good with dogs they know, but they struggle with the difficult cases, the ones who've been traumatized or abandoned, the ones who don't trust easily." Lily stared at the coffee cup, steam rising from its surface like visible warmth. Work meant structure, schedules, expectations. It meant answering questions about her past and providing references she didn't have. It meant existing in systems designed for people who lived in houses and had social security, numbers, and could prove they belonged somewhere. "I don't have experience," she said. Not the kind you could put on paper. Experience comes in different forms, Marcus replied. You've been surviving in the same environment as those dogs, using the same skills, following the same rules. You understand the psychology of creatures who've learned that humans can't be trusted, who approach every interaction with suspicion. That's exactly the kind of experience I need. The coffee was real, Lily discovered when she finally retrieved the cup. Not the burnt dregs from a diner's pot that had been sitting too long, but fresh coffee with cream already added, sweet enough to cut the bitterness without masking the rich flavor. She wrapped her fingers around the metal cup, absorbing the combo. Heat through her gloves. Where would I live? The question surprised her. She hadn't consciously decided to consider his offer, but her mind had already begun calculating practical details. There's a small apartment above the kennels, Marcus said. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and private. Comes with the job, along with meals and a salary. An apartment. Walls and a door that locked from the inside. Heat that didn't depend on finding shelter or burning scraps in a metal drum. The concept felt surreal after months of measuring her life in terms of hours survived and calories obtained. I don't have identification, she admitted. No references. No permanent address. Marcus nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. We can work around those things. There are ways to establish identity for people who need a fresh start. It takes time, but it's possible. The dogs had returned to their patrol of the alley, giving the humans a wide berth, but maintaining surveillance of their territory. Lily watched them move with coordinated precision, each animal knowing its role in the pack's survival strategy. They'd adapted to city life by developing systems that worked within the urban environment while preserving their essential nature, maybe. Adaptation didn't have to mean losing everything that made you who you were. This isn't charity, Marcus said, correctly reading her hesitation. I need help with the business, and you have skills that would be valuable. It's a trade your abilities for security and compensation. Nothing more complicated than that. But everything was more complicated than that, and they both knew it. Taking his offer meant trusting a stranger with her survival, abandoning the hard-won knowledge of how to exist independently for the promise of something better. It meant believing that someone would follow through on commitments made to a person. With no legal existence and no way to enforce agreements, the wind picked up, driving snow across the alley in spirals that stung exposed skin and reminded Lily that winter was far from over. The coffee was warming her from the inside, but her feet had lost feeling despite the layers of newspaper she'd stuffed into her boots. Her jacket provided minimal protection against the cold, and the metal rod in her hand was starting to freeze. To her glove, "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked. Marcus pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, placing it next to the empty coffee cup. Sullivan Dog Training. You can call the number, check references, verify that I am who I say I am. There's also an address you can visit the facility, see the setup, meet some of the dogs I work with. The business card felt substantial between her fingers, embossed lettering on quality paper that spoke of legitimate enterprise. But legitimacy didn't guarantee good intentions, and Lily had learned to be suspicious of things that seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed to her desperation. I need time to think, she said, pocketing the card. Of course. Marcus returned to his truck but didn't start the engine. I'll be here tomorrow night, same time. If you decide you're interested, we can talk more. If not, no harm done. Lily watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing around the corner and leaving her alone with the dogs and the decision that could change everything. The pack had resumed their investigation of the dumpster, their brief tolerance of human presence giving way to the serious business of survival. She understood their position perfectly. Territory was safety, routine was survival, and change even. Change that promised improvement carried risks that could prove fatal. The pack had found a system that worked, a way of existing that met their basic needs without requiring trust in anything beyond their own abilities. But as she made her way through the alleys toward the abandoned building where she'd been sleeping, Lily found herself thinking about the apartment above the kennels. She imagined walls that blocked the wind, a door that locked, a bed that didn't require constant vigilance. She thought about regular meals and work that used skills she developed rather than simply demanding endurance. The business card remained in her pocket throughout the night, a small rectangle of possibility that she touched repeatedly to confirm it was real. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would visit the ranch during daylight hours, when she could see clearly and escape easily if necessary. She would evaluate Marcus's claims, test his offer for hidden conditions, determine whether he was truly offering partnership or simply dressed-up charity. But even as she planned her reconnaissance, Lily felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a fragile kernel of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to survive than fighting dogs for scraps in frozen alleys. The decision made, she spent the day preparing. She found a mirror in the bathroom of a gas station and attempted to make herself presentable, washing her face and hands with paper towels and cold water. She combed her hair with her fingers and tried to assess what Marcus would see when he looked at her, not the desperate scavenger from the alley, but someone capable of learning, of contributing, of deserving a chance. The face in the mirror looked older than 17, marked by months of hardship and decisions no teenager should have to make. But it also looked determined, intelligent, surviving. Maybe that would be enough. The Sullivan Dog Training Facility sprawled across the Colorado prairie, like something from a different world than the concrete maze Lily had called home for months. She approached it on foot from the highway, having hitchhiked 23 miles in the back of a farmer's pickup truck, whose driver asked no questions about her destination or circumstances. The ranch sat behind a simple wooden fence, clean lines and honest construction that spoke of permanence without pretension. Lily crouched behind a cluster of cottonwood trees at the property's edge, studying the layout with the same tactical attention she'd learned to apply to urban territories. The main house was modest but well-maintained, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun in geometric patterns of light and shadow. Behind it, a series of connected buildings formed the kennel complex, long, low structures designed for function. Rather than aesthetics, dogs moved in outdoor runs attached to each building, their behavior ranging from the relaxed contentment of well-cared-for animals to the nervous energy of newcomers, still adjusting to their environment. Even at a distance, Lily could read the subtle differences in their postures, the way some lounged in the sun while others paced the fence lines or watched the horizon with the alertness of creatures who hadn't yet learned to trust their safety. A woman emerged from one of the kennel buildings, carrying a bucket and moving with the efficient purpose of someone who understood that animal care operated on schedules that couldn't be negotiated. She was older than Lily, maybe mid-30s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothing that prioritized durability over fashion. The dogs responded to her presence with tail wags and excited barking, the kind of greeting reserved for pack members who'd proven their reliability. Lily watched the woman work her way through the kennels, distributing food and checking water bowls with the systematic attention of someone who'd developed routines based on experience. She paused at certain runs longer than others, paying extra attention to animals whose body language suggested anxiety or illness. The care she displayed wasn't the detached professionalism of someone simply doing a job, but the invested concern of someone who genuinely cared about the welfare of her charges. The sound of an approaching vehicle made Lily press deeper into the cover of the trees. Marcus's pickup truck appeared on the gravel road that led to the ranch, kicking up dust that caught the afternoon light like golden smoke. He parked near the main house and climbed out, immediately greeted by the chorus of barking that announced his arrival to every dog on the property. Lily had spent hours deciding whether to make this trip, weighing the risks of leaving her familiar territory against the potential rewards of investigating Marcus's offer. Street survival had taught her to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true, but it had also taught her to recognize genuine opportunities when they appeared. The business card in her pocket had worn soft from handling, and she'd memorized every detail on it during the sleepless nights she'd spent considering her options. Now, watching Marcus move through the kennels with the same calm authority he'd displayed in the alley, she began to believe that his offer might be legitimate. He moved among the dogs without fear or hesitation, reading their signals and responding appropriately to each animal's individual needs. A nervous border collie received gentle encouragement, while a dominant Rottweiler got firm correction delivered without anger or intimidation. The woman, his assistant, Lily, assumed, approached Marcus with a clipboard and what appeared to be a report on the day's activities. They stood near the central building, close enough that Lily could see their body language, but too far away to hear their conversation. The interaction was professional but comfortable, the dynamic of people who'd worked together long enough to develop efficient communication patterns. Lily remained hidden until late afternoon, studying the rhythm of the ranch like she'd once studied the schedules of garbage pickup and police patrols in the city. The facility operated with clockwork precision: feeding times, exercise periods, training sessions that moved different groups of dogs through structured activities, designed to build confidence and obedience. But it was the quality of care that impressed her most. These weren't animals being warehoused or processed through a system. Each dog received individual attention based on its specific needs and temperament. She watched Marcus work with a German Shepherd that showed signs of aggression, using patient repetition and positive reinforcement to modify behavior that had probably made the animal difficult to place in a home. The session lasted an hour, with Marcus never raising his voice or showing frustration despite the dog's initial resistance to commands. By the end, the Shepherd was responding to basic instructions and even accepting treats from Marcus's hand. Small victories that represented significant progress for an animal that had likely been labeled as problematic by previous handlers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the training fields, Lily made her decision. She would reveal herself, test Marcus's reaction to her unannounced visit, and determine whether his offer extended beyond the controlled environment of their first meeting. She rose from her hiding place and walked toward the main gate, her approach calculated to be visible but non-threatening. Marcus spotted her before she reached the fence, his head turning toward her movement with the alertness of someone who'd learned to monitor his environment. But instead of alarm or suspicion, his expression showed recognition followed by what might have been relief. He said something to his assistant, who glanced toward Lily with curiosity rather than concern, then began walking in her direction. "You came," he said when he reached the gate, his tone suggesting he hadn't been entirely certain she would follow through on investigating his offer. "I wanted to see if what you told me was true," Lily replied, maintaining the careful distance that had become second nature during months of survival. Marcus nodded and opened the gate, stepping aside to let her enter the property. "I hoped you would. Come on, I'll show you around." The tour began at the kennels, where Marcus introduced her to the dogs currently in his care. Each animal had a story: the retriever mix who'd been returned by 3 different families for destructive behavior, the pit bull who'd been seized from a fighting ring and needed to learn that humans could be trusted, the elderly beagle whose owner had died and left her confused and grieving. Marcus shared these histories without melodrama or manipulation, simply providing context that explained each dog's current needs and training goals. Lily found herself drawn into the stories, recognizing in these animals the same themes of abandonment, trauma, and adaptation that had shaped her own experience. "This is Sarah," Marcus said, introducing his assistant as they moved through the facility. "She's been with me for 4 years, handles most of the daily care and basic training." Sarah extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuine rather than forced. Marcus mentioned he might be bringing on additional help. Have you worked with dogs before? Not professionally, Lily replied, accepting the handshake despite her usual reluctance to engage in casual physical contact. But I've spent time around them. Sometimes that's better than formal training, Sarah said. Dogs respond to authenticity more than technique. Marcus can teach you the technical skills, but you either understand animal psychology or you don't. They concluded the tour at the apartment Marcus had mentioned, a small but complete living space built above the main kennel building. The room was furnished simply but comfortably, a bed, a dresser, a small kitchen area with basic appliances, and a bathroom with hot water and clean towels. To Lily, who'd been sleeping in doorways and abandoned buildings, it looked like luxury. The rent comes out of your salary, Marcus explained, but it's reasonable. You'd have privacy and independence while still being close enough to help with emergency situations that might arise with the dogs. Lily walked to the window and looked out over the training fields, where the last light of day was painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, the mountains rose like a promise of permanence, unchanging landmarks in a world that had taught her to expect constant motion and instability. What would my actual duties be? She asked, turning back to face Marcus. Initially, basic care, feeding, cleaning, exercise. But I think you'd pick up the training aspects quickly. You already understand pack dynamics and animal communication better than most people I've worked with. With some instruction on technique and safety procedures, you could probably handle the rehabilitation cases that require more specialized attention. The offer was more generous than Lily had dared to hope, but generosity made her suspicious. Why me? You could hire someone with experience, someone with references and credentials. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, considering his answer carefully. Because experience isn't the same as understanding. I've worked with plenty of people who knew the technical aspects of dog training but couldn't connect with animals who'd been damaged by their interactions with humans. You've lived through the same kind of experiences that traumatize these dogs. You understand survival, adaptation, the process of learning to trust again. And if it doesn't work out, then we figure out what went wrong and try to fix it. If it still doesn't work, you leave with enough money to get yourself established somewhere else. But I don't think it will come to that. Lily spent another hour at the ranch, asking questions about schedules, responsibilities, and expectations. Marcus answered everything directly, without the evasiveness that would have triggered her suspicion. Sarah added practical details about the daily routine, the quirks of individual dogs, and the rhythm of life at the facility. As they talked, Lily found herself relaxing in ways she'd almost forgotten were possible. The conversation felt normal, professional, focused on practical matters rather than survival strategies. These people weren't asking her to prove her worthiness or justify her existence. They were treating her like someone capable of learning and contributing, someone whose abilities had value. When she finally prepared to leave, Marcus walked her to the gate and handed her a key attached to a simple metal ring. The apartment key, he explained. In case you decide you want to start tomorrow. Lily stared at the key, feeling its weight in her palm. Such a small object, but it represented the possibility of transformation, of trading the exhausting uncertainty of street life for the structured predictability of honest work. I need one more night to think about it, she said, pocketing the key next to the business card that had brought her here. Take all the time you need, Marcus replied. But remember, winter's only going to get worse, and those dogs in the alley aren't going to get more generous with their territory. The ride back to the city came courtesy of a delivery truck whose driver was heading to Denver for a late pickup. Lily sat in the passenger seat, watching the ranch disappear behind them, and tried to imagine herself as someone who lived in that apartment, who worked with those dogs, who had a purpose beyond simply surviving until tomorrow. The city welcomed Her back with its familiar soundtrack of traffic and sirens, its maze of alleys and doorways that had sheltered her through the hardest months of her life. But tonight, even the urban landscape looked different. The buildings seemed smaller, less permanent, more like obstacles to be navigated rather than the wheel. Totality of her world. She spent her final night on the streets, in a loading dock near the train yards, listening to the distant sound of freight. Cars coupling and uncoupling in the classification yard. The rhythm was oddly comforting, a mechanical heartbeat that spoke of movement and destination, of cargo traveling from one place to another with purpose and intention. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would return to the ranch, try Marcus's offer, and see if someone who'd learned to survive by fighting dogs for scraps could transform herself into someone who helped heal the damage that abandonment and cruelty inflicted on trusting creatures. Key in her pocket felt warm against her fingers as she began the journey back to the Sullivan dog training facility, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the hope that maybe, finally, she'd found a place where her particular combination of hardness and understanding could serve a purpose larger than simple survival. The prairie stretched ahead of her, vast and open and full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. The apartment above the kennels smelled like pine soap and fresh laundry, scents so foreign to Lily's recent experience that they almost overwhelmed her senses. She stood in the doorway for several minutes before crossing the threshold, studying the space like she'd once studied alleyways for potential threats or escape routes. But here, the analysis was different, cataloging comforts rather than dangers, possibilities rather than pitfalls. A note waited on the small kitchen table, written in Marcus's careful handwriting. "Welcome home. Take today to settle in, Sarah. We'll show you the morning routine tomorrow at 6 a.m. There's food in the refrigerator, and clean clothes in the dresser that should fit approximately. No pressure, just possibilities." And Lily read the note 3 times, focusing on the word home until its meaning seemed to shift and expand. She'd lived in foster homes, group homes, temporary shelters, but none of those places had ever been described to her as home without conditions attached. Here was someone using the word casually, as if her belonging was already assumed rather than something she needed to earn. The refrigerator contained milk that hadn't soured, bread without mold spots, sandwich meat that smelled fresh, and vegetables that still retained their color and firmness. Lily assembled a meal mechanically, her hands moving through the motions while her mind struggled to process the abundance. 6 months ago, this would have been normal. Now it felt like stepping into someone else's life. She ate slowly, forcing herself to taste each bite rather than consuming it with the desperate efficiency that hunger had taught her. The flavors were clean and distinct, the sharp bite of mustard, the salt of ham, the crispness of lettuce that hadn't wilted in the cold. Food as pleasure rather than mere survival, a concept she'd almost forgotten existed. The clothes in the dresser were practical rather than fashionable work jeans, flannel shirts, thermal underwear designed for Colorado winters. Everything was new, tags still attached, sized to fit someone of Lily's approximate dimensions. Marcus had invested in her success before knowing whether she'd even accept his offer, a gesture of faith that made something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Her first shower in the apartment's bathroom lasted 45 minutes. Lily stood, underwater hot enough to turn her skin pink, letting the steam carry away months of accumulated grime and the persistent chill that had settled into her bones. She used the provided shampoo twice, watching gray water spiral down the drain like evidence of a life she was washing away. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that was thick and soft rather than threadbare, Lily barely recognized the person in the mirror. Clean skin revealed features that malnutrition had sharpened, but not destroyed. Her dark hair, freed from the matted tangles of street life, fell past her shoulders in waves that caught the bathroom light. She looked younger than she had in months, but also somehow more substantial, as if proper nutrition and basic hygiene had restored not just her appearance, but her fundamental existence. The first night in a real bed proved more challenging than sleeping on concrete had been. The mattress was too soft, the silence too complete, the safety too unfamiliar for her nervous system to accept. Lily lay awake listening for threats that never materialized, checking the locks repeatedly, positioning herself where she could see both the door and the window. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and fragmented, interrupted by dreams of dogs in alleys and the sound of footsteps that might belong to people who meant her harm. Morning arrived with the gentle cacophony of 43 dogs beginning their day. Barking, whining, the scratch of claws on concrete, the rattle of food bowls being moved. Sounds that spoke of routine and expectation rather than the chaos Lily had grown accustomed to associating with survival. She dressed in the new work clothes and made her way downstairs, where Sarah was already moving through the kennels with systematic efficiency. "First day jitters?" Sarah asked, noting Lily's careful posture and the way her eyes constantly scanned for potential problems. "Something like that," Lily replied, accepting the clipboard Sarah handed her. "Normal reaction. This place can be overwhelming at first, so many animals, so many individuals needs to keep track of. But you'll develop routines that make it manageable. Today we'll start with the basics: feeding schedules, cleaning protocols, recognizing signs of illness or distress." The morning routine began at 5:30 with medication for dogs requiring special treatment. An arthritic golden retriever named Chester received anti-inflammatory pills hidden in cheese, while a nervous rescue named Pixie got anxiety medication that helped her cope with the stress of rehabilitation. Sarah explained each case as they worked, providing context that helped Lily understand not just what they were doing, but why. Specific protocols had been developed. Feeding time revealed the individual personalities of the dogs in ways that surprised Lily. She'd expected competition, aggression, the kind of resource guarding she'd witnessed in the alley pack. Instead, she found animals who'd learned to trust that meals would come regularly, who could afford to be patient because their next opportunity to eat wasn't uncertain. Some dogs ate with methodical precision, others with enthusiastic speed. A few required hand feeding due to medical conditions or anxiety issues that made normal eating difficult. Lily found herself naturally adapting her approach to each animal's needs, reading their body language and adjusting her behavior accordingly. "You're a natural at this," Sarah observed as Lily successfully convinced a traumatized pit bull mix to accept food from her hand. "Most new people try to force interactions, but you're letting the dogs set the pace." Lily watched the pit bull king, according to his kennel card, retreat to the back of his run with his food bowl. He's been hurt by people before. Pushing him would just confirm that humans can't be trusted. Exactly. King came from a fighting ring where kindness was used as a weapon. Handlers would act gentle to lower the dog's guard, then hurt them when they relaxed. He's learning that genuine kindness exists, but it's a slow process. The parallel wasn't lost on Lily. She developed similar defenses, learned to be suspicious of unexpected generosity, to assume that kindness came with hidden costs. Watching King eat in careful isolation, she recognized the posture of someone who'd learned that survival meant never fully trusting the safety of any situation. The cleaning routine that followed feeding was physically demanding but oddly satisfying. Each kennel required fresh water, clean bedding, and removal of waste tasks that seemed menial but provided the foundation for everything else the facility accomplished. Clean, comfortable environments allowed the dogs to focus on rehabilitation rather than basic survival needs. Lily found rhythm in the repetitive work, the systematic progression from one kennel to the next, creating structure that her chaotic recent life had lacked. There was dignity in the labor, purpose in maintaining spaces where damaged creatures could begin to heal. She worked steadily, noting which dogs sought interaction and which preferred to be left alone, building mental files on individual temperaments and needs. The first training session she observed involved a young German shepherd named Atlas who'd been returned by his adoptive family for destructive behavior. Marcus worked with the dog in a fenced training area, using positive reinforcement to teach basic commands while addressing the underlying anxiety that drove the destructive activities. "He's not being malicious," Marcus explained as Atlas successfully completed a stay command. "He's bored and understimulated." German shepherds need jobs, mental challenges. When they don't get appropriate outlets for their intelligence, they create their own entertainment. Lily watched Marcus guide Atlas through increasingly complex exercises, each success building the dog's confidence while channeling his energy into productive activities. The transformation was subtle but visible. Atlas's posture shifted from nervous energy to focused attention, his responses becoming more reliable as he learned to trust that correct behavior would be rewarded rather than ignored. "Could I try working with him?" Lily asked when the session concluded. Marcus studied her for a moment, then handed her the treat pouch and training clicker. "Start with something simple. Ask for a sit. Click when he does it, then reward immediately. The timing is crucial. The click has to happen the instant he performs the behavior you want." Atlas responded to Lily's commands with the same attention he'd given Marcus, but she noticed subtle differences in his body language. The dog seemed more relaxed with her, less concerned about making mistakes. She realized that her own recent experience with rehabilitation might be communicating something that Atlas recognized. The understanding that learning new behaviors was a process that required patience with setbacks. The afternoon brought individual attention. When dogs who'd been isolated due to behavioral issues received one-on-one interaction designed to rebuild their confidence around humans. Lily found herself assigned to work with a border collie mix named Scout, who developed extreme shyness after being abandoned by his previous owners. Scout cowered in the corner of his kennel when Lily entered, his body language screaming trauma and mistrust. She settled on the floor without trying to approach him, simply sharing the space while reading from a book Sarah had given her about canine psychology. The technique was counterintuitive, ignoring the dog to help him learn that her presence didn't automatically mean demands would be placed on him. 20 minutes passed before Scout showed the first sign of curiosity, lifting his head to study this human who wasn't insisting on interaction. Lily continued reading aloud, her voice creating a calm soundtrack that gradually convinced Scout she posed no immediate threat. By the end of the hour, he'd moved close enough to sniff her boots, the first voluntary approach he'd made toward a human in weeks. "Breakthrough," Sarah said when Lily reported the progress. "Scout's been here 6 weeks, and that's the most engagement he's shown with anyone. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." The praise felt strange after months of existing without recognition or encouragement. Lily had grown accustomed to measuring success in terms of mere survival, finding food, avoiding danger, making it through another night. Now she was being acknowledged for skills she hadn't realized she possessed, for abilities that had value beyond keeping herself alive. Evening brought feeding time again, and Lily noticed how differently she moved through the kennels compared to that morning. The initial overwhelming complexity had resolved into recognizable patterns. She knew which dogs needed medication with their meals, which required special diets, which would try to escape when their kennel doors opened. Information that had seemed impossibly complex 12 hours earlier now felt manageable, even routine. Marcus found her cleaning the last set of water bowls as the sun began to set across the prairie. "How was the first day?" "Harder than I expected," Lily admitted, "but also easier, if that makes sense." Perfect sense. The work itself isn't complicated, but learning to care about this many individual creatures can be emotionally exhausting. "You did well today. Sarah says you have natural instincts for reading animal behavior." Lily set down the water bowl she'd been scrubbing and looked out across the kennel runs, where dogs were settling into their evening routines. Some curled up on their beds, others maintained vigilant watches of their territories. Each animal was responding to the end of day according to its own personality and history, but all of them showed signs of basic contentment that spoke of needs being met. "They trust the routine," she observed. "They know what to expect, when it will happen, who they can depend on. That must be something like peace." Marcus nodded, following her gaze across the facility they'd spent the day maintaining together. "Trust is the foundation of everything else we do here. Without it, no real healing can happen." That night, Lily fell asleep more easily than she had the night before. The sounds of the kennels had become familiar rather than foreign, a soundtrack of contained safety rather than potential danger. For the first time in months, she slept deeply enough to dream of something other than survival, imagining instead a future where her days were measured in small victories and steady progress rather than desperate calculations and narrow escapes. Outside her window, the dogs settled into their own rest, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring food, attention, and the patient work of learning to trust again. In the apartment above them, a girl who'd fought those same battles was discovering that healing was possible, that there were people willing to invest in damaged creatures without demanding immediate returns. The transformation had begun, as quiet and gradual as the trust that made it possible. 3 weeks into her new life at the Sullivan Dog Training Facility, Lily had developed a confidence that surprised even her. The morning routines had become second nature, the precise timing of medications, the individual quirks of 43 different personalities, the subtle signs that indicated when an animal was having a good day or struggling with old traumas. She moved through the kennels with purpose now, no longer the hesitant newcomer who'd arrived with nothing but street wisdom and desperate hope. But it was precisely this growing sense of security that made the crisis, when it came, feel like a betrayal of everything she'd begun to believe about her new world. The trouble started with a phone call at 7 in the morning, while Lily was preparing breakfast for the diabetic beagle in Kennel 12. Marcus answered with his usual professional greeting, but his tone shifted quickly from pleasant efficiency to tense concern. Lily couldn't hear the words, but she could read the change in his posture, the way his free hand raked through his hair in a gesture she'd learned to associate with serious problems. "When?" Marcus asked, then listened for a long moment. "No, I understand. Yes, we'll cooperate fully. Yes, I know what's at stake." He hung up and stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with better news. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the weight of someone who'd just received information that would change everything. "Sarah, Lily," he called, his voice carrying across the kennel complex with unusual urgency. "I need you both here, now." They gathered in the small office attached to the main kennel building, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets, training schedules, and veterinary records that documented the rehabilitation progress of every animal in their care. Marcus closed the door, an unusual action that immediately heightened the tension in the room. "That was animal control," he began without preamble. "There's been a complaint filed against the facility. Someone is claiming we're operating without proper licenses, that we're mistreating animals, that we're running an illegal breeding operation." The words hit Lily like a physical blow. She'd been in the system long enough to know how quickly accusations could unravel carefully constructed lives, how institutions that claimed to protect could become instruments of destruction when bureaucracy aligned with malicious intent. "Who filed the complaint?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the obvious concern in her eyes. "They wouldn't say over the phone, but I can guess. Robert Hartley's been trying to buy this land for 2 years. He wants to develop it into a shopping complex, and I've refused every offer he's made. This feels like his way of forcing a sale." Lily had heard Hartley's name before, usually in contexts that involved money, political influence, and a willingness to use whatever leverage was necessary to achieve his goals. He owned half the commercial real estate in Jefferson County and had a reputation for making problems disappear for people who were willing to sell to him at below market prices. What happens now? Lily asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Full inspection tomorrow morning, Marcus replied. They'll examine every aspect of our operation licenses, health records, facility conditions, financial records. If they find any violations, even minor ones, they can shut us down immediately and seize the animals. The thought of the dogs being taken away, scattered to different shelters or worse, made Lily's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. These animals had finally found safety, had begun to trust again, had started the slow process of healing from whatever traumas had brought them here. The idea of disrupting that progress because of political maneuvering felt like a particular kind of cruelty. Are we actually in compliance? She asked. Marcus nodded, but his confidence seemed forced. Our licenses are current, health records are up to date, facilities meet all state requirements. But inspectors can be creative when they want to find problems. A water bowl that's slightly dirty, a kennel that's 1 inch smaller than regulation. Paperwork filed a day late, any of those things can become violations if someone wants them to be. They spent the rest of the day in frantic preparation, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, organizing paperwork into meticulous order, double-checking that every animal's documentation was complete and accurate. Lily found herself working with desperate efficiency, driven by the knowledge that failure could mean losing not just her job, but the sense of purpose and belonging she discovered here. The dogs seemed to sense the tension in their human caretakers. Animals who normally greeted the staff with enthusiastic barking remained subdued, watching with the alertness of creatures who'd learned that human stress often preceded disruptions in their world. Even the most social dogs kept to the backs of their kennels, waiting to see what changes the day would bring. As evening approached, Marcus gathered the staff again, this time including Janet Morrison, the part-time trainer who came in 3 days a week to work with the more challenging behavioral cases. The group huddled around the office desk like conspirators planning a resistance. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward. The inspection isn't just about licensing violations. If they shut us down, these dogs don't just go to other facilities. Hartley has connections with animal control. He's been pushing for policies that classify behavioral rehabilitation as unnecessary expense. Most of these animals would be euthanized within a week. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Lily looked around the circle of faces, Sarah with her graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of years of patient animal care, Janet with her specialized knowledge of trauma recovery, Marcus with his quiet authority and genuine commitment to healing. These people had dedicated their lives to saving creatures that society had written off as too damaged or too difficult to help. We won't let that happen, Sarah said finally, her voice carrying steel despite its quietness. What choice do we have? Janet asked. If they want to shut us down, they'll find a way. Hartley has too much influence, too many connections. Lily found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to contribute to the conversation. Maybe we don't fight them directly. Maybe we make shutting us down more expensive than leaving us alone. The others turned to look at her, and Lily felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with being the center of attention. But months of street survival had taught her to think tactically, to find advantages in situations that seemed hopeless. Hartley's power comes from operating in shadows, she continued, her confidence growing as the plan formed in her mind. He files complaints through intermediaries, works behind the scenes, makes problems disappear quietly. What if we made this inspection very public? What if we invited every news outlet in Denver, to come watch animal control shut down a facility that's successfully rehabilitating damaged animals. Marcus's eyes lit up with the first hope she'd seen in him all day. Media pressure. Make it politically costly for them to follow through on obviously trumped-up charges. Exactly. And not just the media. What about all the families who've adopted dogs from here? What about the veterinarians who refer cases to us? What about the other rescue organizations who support what we do? Sarah was already reaching for the phone. I know a reporter at Channel 7 who did a story on animal welfare last year. She'd be interested in a story about a developer using animal control as a weapon against a legitimate rescue operation. The next few hours blurred together in a frenzy of phone calls, emails, and strategic planning. They contacted every media outlet within 50 miles, reached out to adoption families, alerted veterinary clinics that referred cases to the facility. The story they told was simple and compelling. A successful animal rehabilitation program was being targeted for closure by a powerful developer who wanted their land for commercial development. The response exceeded their wildest expectations. By midnight, they'd received commitments from 3 television stations, 2 newspapers, and a radio talk show host who specialized in exposing corporate malfeasance. Former clients began posting testimonials on social media, sharing photos of dogs who'd been saved from euthanasia and successfully integrated into loving families. Dr. Elizabeth Romano, the veterinarian who'd been referring cases to Sullivan, dog training for 3 years, called personally to offer her support. I've been looking for an excuse to go public about Hartley's influence on animal control policies, she said. This gives me the perfect platform. I'll be there tomorrow morning with documentation of every case I've referred to you in there. Successful outcomes. Lily worked through the night, helping Marcus and Sarah prepare presentation materials that would demonstrate the facility's success rate, the quality of care provided, and the positive impact on both animals and families. But even as she focused on the practical tasks, part of her mind remained fixed on a deeper concern. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd spent months trying to avoid. Media scrutiny, official investigation, the possibility that someone might start asking questions about her background or immigration status. She'd built her new life on the assumption that she could remain invisible within the legitimate structure Marcus had provided. Now that invisibility was about to be shattered. You're worried about something, Sarah observed during a brief break. In their preparations, Lily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about her concerns. I don't have much experience with this kind of public attention. What if they start asking questions about my qualifications, my background? Sarah studied her with the same perceptive attention she applied to reading animal behavior. Marcus hired you because you're good with the dogs, not because of your paperwork. Anyone who watches you work can see that you belong here. Don't let fear of exposure make you doubt your own value. The advice was easier to give than to follow, but Lily found some comfort in Sarah's confidence. She'd learned to trust these people over the past 3 weeks, had seen their genuine commitment to the animals in their care. If they believed she belonged here, maybe she could find the courage to fight for the right to stay. Dawn arrived gray and cold, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the prairie like a physical weight. The inspection team arrived at precisely 8 o'clock. 2 animal control officers, a county health inspector, and a man in expensive suit who introduced himself as a representative from the county attorney's office, but who Lily suspected was there on Hartley's behalf. But they weren't alone. The parking area around the facility had been filled with news vans, satellite trucks, and cars belonging to supporters who'd come to witness the proceedings. Dr. Romano stood near the main gate with a thick folder of medical records, while representatives from 3 other rescue organizations waited with their own documentation of successful partnerships with Sullivan Dog Training. The lead inspector, a middle-aged woman named Collins, seemed taken aback by the media presence. She'd clearly expected a routine closure proceeding, not a public spectacle that would require her to justify every decision in front of television cameras. "This is highly irregular," she complained to Marcus. "Inspections are typically private proceedings. I'm not aware of any law that prevents the public from observing how their tax dollars are spent." Marcus replied evenly, "We're proud of our operation and have nothing to hide." The inspection began with paperwork review, conducted in the office under the watchful eyes of reporters and cameras. Collins examined every license, permit, and health certificate with microscopic attention, clearly hoping to find some technicality that would justify closure. But Marcus's documentation was flawless, organized with the obsessive attention to detail of someone who'd known this day might come. When the paperwork revealed no violations, the team moved to physical inspection of the facilities. Collins measured kennel dimensions with a tape measure, checked water temperatures, examined food storage areas with the intensity of someone determined to find fault. The county attorney's representative made notes on a legal pad, his expression growing increasingly frustrated as each potential violation proved to be in full compliance with regulations. The dogs, sensing the tension but accustomed to strangers, performed beautifully during the behavioral assessments. King, the former fighting dog, demonstrated the gentle temperament he'd developed through months of patient rehabilitation. Scout, the border collie who'd been too traumatized to interact with humans, accepted treats from Collins's hand without showing signs of distress. "These animals appear well cared for," Collins admitted grudgingly to the cameras. "I see no evidence of mistreatment or neglect." Dr. Romano stepped forward with her medical records, documenting case after case of successful rehabilitation. "This facility has saved the lives of animals that would otherwise have been euthanized," she stated clearly for the cameras. "Their success rate exceeds 90%, which is unprecedented in animal rehabilitation work." The man in the expensive suit tried to raise questions about financial irregularities, suggesting that the facility might be operating as an unlicensed business rather than a legitimate training operation. But Marcus was ready for this line of attack, producing tax records, business licenses, and financial statements that demonstrated full compliance with all applicable regulations. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the inspection was failing to produce the violations that would justify closure. Collins grew increasingly defensive as reporters asked pointed questions about the timing of the complaint and the identity of the person who'd filed it. The county attorney's representative made several phone calls, speaking in low tones that suggested he was receiving instructions from someone who wasn't pleased with the way things were developing. The turning point came when Channel 7's investigative reporter, a woman named Linda Martinez who'd built her career on exposing corruption, asked Collins directly whether she was aware of Robert Hartley's attempts to purchase the property. "I don't see how that's relevant to this inspection," Collins replied, but her discomfort was obvious. "It seems relevant when the complaint that triggered this inspection appears to be without merit," Martinez pressed. "Are you concerned that animal control is being used as a tool to harass legitimate businesses on behalf of powerful developers?" Collins ended the inspection abruptly, gathering her team and departing without the closure order that everyone had expected. The county attorney's representative left even more quickly, refusing to answer questions about who had authorized the investigation. Media circus that followed was everything Marcus had hoped for and more. The evening news led with stories about a successful animal rescue operation being targeted by corrupt officials working on behalf of a powerful developer. Editorial pages condemned the misuse of government resources to serve private interests. Social media exploded with support for Sullivan dog training and condemnation of Hartley's tactics, but it was the personal testimonials that proved most powerful. Family after family came forward to share stories of dogs they'd adopted from the facility, animals who'd been traumatized, abandoned, or marked for euthanization, but who'd become beloved family members through the patient work of Marcus, Sarah, and their team. Lily found herself featured in several of the stories. Identified as a specialist in working with traumatized animals who joined the staff and made remarkable progress with the most difficult cases. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she began to understand that her visible success was part of the facility's defense. She represented the kind of second chances that Sullivan Dog Training offered, not just to animals, but to people who'd been written off by society. Robert Hartley's response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours of the failed inspection, he filed lawsuits alleging defamation, interfered with several of the facility's supplier contracts, and began a whisper campaign suggesting that Marcus was financially unstable and emotionally unfit to operate an animal care facility. The attacks were clearly designed to exhaust the facility's resources and undermine public confidence, but they had an unexpected effect. Instead of weakening support for Sullivan Dog Training, Hartley's obvious vindictiveness strengthened the resolve of everyone who'd witnessed the inspection. Donors emerged to help with legal costs, suppliers offered services at reduced rates, and volunteers arrived to help with daily operations. Dr. Romano organized a coalition of veterinarians who publicly endorsed the facility's work and pledged to refer more cases. Other rescue organizations offered partnerships and resource sharing. What Hartley had intended as an isolated target became the center of a network of mutual support that strengthened everyone involved. The legal battles continued for weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Hartley had overplayed his hand, made his intentions too obvious, and underestimated the public sympathy for both the animals and the people who cared for them. When the county attorney's office finally announced that all charges against Sullivan Dog Training had been dropped and all permits confirmed as valid, the victory felt like vindication not just for Marcus, but for everyone who believed that damaged creatures deserved second chances. For Lily, the crisis had been transformative in ways she hadn't expected. She'd discovered that the life she'd built at the ranch was worth fighting for, that the people she worked with would stand by her even when doing so involved personal risk. More importantly, she'd learned that her own voice had power when used in defense of things that mattered. The night after the official vindication, she sat in her apartment looking out over the kennels where 43 dogs slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their sanctuary was safe. Tomorrow would bring the usual routines: feeding, cleaning, training, the patient work of healing that was both her job and her calling. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel something she'd almost forgotten was possible: the deep satisfaction of having fought for something larger than her own survival and won. 6 months after the crisis that nearly destroyed Sullivan Dog Training, Lily stood in the morning sunshine watching a miracle unfold in the main exercise yard. Scout, the border collie who'd once cowered in the corner of his kennel at the sight of any human, was teaching a new arrival, a traumatized German shepherd named Phoenix, that people could be trusted. The lesson wasn't verbal. Of course, Scout simply demonstrated through his calm interaction with Lily that her presence meant safety rather than threat. When she offered treats, Scout accepted them with confidence, showing Phoenix that food from human hands carried no hidden dangers. When she called his name, Scout came willingly, tail wagging, displaying the kind of trust that Phoenix hadn't dared to show anyone in the 3 weeks since his arrival. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine when Lily first arrived at the ranch, a former victim becoming a teacher, passing along the lessons of healing to another damaged soul. But these transformations had become commonplace at Sullivan Dog Training, stories of recovery that played out daily in the kennels and exercise yards. The facility itself had evolved since the confrontation with Hartley. The publicity generated by their successful defense had brought new resources, partnerships, and opportunities that Marcus could never have imagined when he first offered Lily a chance at a different life. Grant money from animal welfare foundations had funded an expansion of the kennels, allowing them to help twice as many dogs. Veterinary schools now sent students for internships, creating a pipeline of newly trained professionals who understood the importance of behavioral rehabilitation. But the most significant change was in the culture of the place. What had once been Marcus's individual mission had become a community effort, with volunteers, supporters, and staff all united around the belief that damaged creatures, human and animal alike, deserved second chances and the patient work necessary to heal old wounds. Lily had grown into her role as head trainer for behavioral rehabilitation cases, a position that utilized every skill she'd developed during her months on the streets. Her ability to read fear, to move without triggering defensive responses, to communicate safety through body language rather than words, had proved invaluable in working with animals who'd learned to distrust human intentions. The appointment had come with a substantial raise, health benefits, and recognition from the professional dog training community that still amazed her. She'd been invited to speak at conferences, to write articles for training journals, to share her insights with other facilities struggling to help traumatized animals. The girl who'd once fought dogs for scraps in frozen alleys was now consulted as an expert in animal psychology and rehabilitation techniques. But success hadn't erased the memories of where she'd come from, or the lessons those experiences had taught her. Every new dog that arrived at the facility reminded her of her own journey from desperation to stability, from isolation to belonging. She saw herself in their wariness, their careful testing of boundaries, their gradual acceptance that safety might actually be permanent rather than temporary. This morning's work involved introducing Phoenix to basic training concepts, starting with the fundamental lesson that cooperation with humans led to positive outcomes rather than punishment or abandonment. The German Shepherd had come from a situation involving neglect and emotional abuse, developing behaviors that made him seem aggressive when he was actually terrified. "He's not mean," Lily explained to Jessica, the newest member of their training staff, as Phoenix retreated to the far corner of the exercise yard. "He's just learned that the best defense against unpredictable humans is to make them keep their distance. We need to show him that we're predictable, that our actions match our intentions." Jessica nodded, taking notes on the techniques Lily was demonstrating. Fresh out of college with a degree in animal science, Jessica had joined the staff 3 months ago with theoretical knowledge but limited experience with severely traumatized animals. She represented the kind of partnership that had become possible since the facility's expansion. Young professionals who brought academic training while learning practical skills from Lily's hard-won expertise. The training session progressed slowly, with Lily maintaining a respectful distance while offering Phoenix choices rather than demands. Food appeared at regular intervals, placed where he could reach it without having to approach her directly. Her voice remained calm and encouraging, never rising to the levels that might trigger memories of angry humans. Every movement was deliberate, non-threatening, designed to communicate safety rather than dominance. After 45 minutes, Phoenix accepted a treat directly from Lily's hand, a breakthrough that would have seemed trivial to an outside observer, but represented significant progress in his journey toward trust. She ended the session immediately, allowing him to process the positive interaction without pushing for additional advances that might overwhelm his capacity to cope. "The key is to always end on a success," Lily told Jessica as they walked back toward the main building. "Dogs who've been traumatized need to learn that good interactions have natural conclusions, that humans don't always want more than they're ready to give." These teaching moments had become a regular part of Lily's routine, sharing knowledge with staff members, volunteers, and visitors who came to learn from Sullivan Dog Training's approach to rehabilitation. She'd discovered that she enjoyed the educational aspect of her work almost as much as the direct animal care, finding satisfaction in helping others develop the skills necessary to heal damaged creatures. The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction, a follow-up visit from The Martinez family, who'd adopted Bella, a pit bull mix, 8 months earlier. They came quarterly to show Marcus and his staff how well their former charges were adapting to family life, bringing photos and stories that validated the work being done at the facility. Bella had arrived at Sullivan Dog Training as a seizure. From a fighting ring, covered in scars and too traumatized to make eye contact with humans. The Martinez children had seen her photo on the facility's website and convinced their parents to visit, despite concerns about adopting a dog with such a difficult background. Now Bella served as a therapy dog for their daughter Emma, who had autism and had formed an extraordinary bond with the gentle giant who'd once been trained to fight. She sleeps in Emma's room every night, Mrs. Martinez explained, showing photos on her phone of the child and dog curled up together. Emma talks to her constantly, tells her about school, about her feelings, about things she can't express to anyone else. Bella just listens with this incredible patience, like she understands exactly what Emma needs. The transformation was visible in both species. Emma, who'd struggled with anxiety and social interaction, had blossomed since Bella's arrival, using her relationship with the dog as a bridge to better communication with her family. Bella had discovered her true calling as a comfort provider, channeling her protective instincts into gentle guardianship of a vulnerable child. Stories like these had become the true measure of success at Sullivan Dog Training, proof that the investment in rehabilitation paid dividends far beyond the immediate rescue of individual animals. Every successfully placed dog carried the potential to transform human lives as well, creating bonds that enriched entire families while providing the animals with the loving homes they'd never experienced. The Martinez visit coincided with the arrival of a documentary crew from National Geographic, who were creating a film about innovative approaches to animal rehabilitation. The attention still made Lily slightly uncomfortable. She preferred working behind the scenes to being in the spotlight, but she'd learned to appreciate the value of publicity in advancing their mission. The documentary team followed her through a typical day, filming her interactions with Phoenix, Scout, and several other dogs at various stages of rehabilitation. They interviewed her about her methods, her philosophy, and the personal experiences that had shaped her approach to working with traumatized animals. "You have an unusual background for someone in this field," the director observed during a break. In filming, most animal behaviorists come from academic training or family traditions in animal care. Your path was quite different. Lily chose her words carefully, as she'd learned to do when discussing her past. Sometimes the best preparation for helping damaged creatures is understanding what it feels like to be damaged yourself. Not everyone who survives trauma becomes equipped to help others heal, but for some of us, those experiences create empathy and insight that can't be taught in classrooms. The response was honest without being confessional, acknowledging her background while maintaining the privacy she'd worked hard to establish. She'd learned to navigate these conversations with the same skills she applied to working with fearful dogs, providing enough information to build trust while maintaining boundaries that protected her from exposure she wasn't ready to handle. Documentary crew also captured the weekly volunteer training session that Lily conducted, teaching community members the basics of animal behavior and rehabilitation techniques. The program had grown from Marcus's recognition that they needed more hands to help with the expanding operation, but it had evolved into something much more significant, a way of spreading knowledge and changing attitudes about animal welfare. Throughout Jefferson County, regular volunteers included retired teachers, college students, local business owners, and families who wanted to contribute to the facility's mission. They learned to read animal body language, to recognize signs of stress or contentment, to provide the kind of patient, consistent care that allowed traumatized creatures to begin healing. Many went on to adopt animals themselves or to support other rescue operations with improved skills and understanding. You're creating a ripple effect, observed Dr. Romano during one of her regular visits to check on the medical status of animals in rehabilitation. Every person you train becomes an advocate for humane treatment, someone who understands that behavioral problems usually have root causes that can be addressed with proper care. The ripple effect had extended far beyond Jefferson County. Other animal welfare organizations had begun implementing training programs based on Sullivan Dog Training's model, adapting Lily's techniques to their own facilities and populations. Professional conferences featured presentations about their approach, and veterinary schools included case studies of their successful rehabilitations in their curricula. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of their impact was visible in the local communities changing attitudes toward damaged animals. Shelters that had once euthanized dogs with behavioral issues now contacted Sullivan Dog Training for advice on rehabilitation strategies. Veterinarians who'd previously recommended euthanasia for aggressive or fearful animals were learning to identify trauma responses and refer cases for treatment. The transformation was particularly evident in animal control's approach to enforcement. The same department that had once attempted to shut down the facility now partnered with them to provide behavioral assessments for animals involved in cruelty cases. Officers received training in recognizing signs of abuse and trauma, understanding that aggressive behavior often reflected past mistreatment rather than inherent viciousness. That evening brought Lily's favorite part of each day, the quiet hours, when the official work was finished and she could spend unstructured time with the animals, who'd become more than professional responsibilities. She moved through the kennels, checking on each dog's comfort and well-being, noting small changes in behavior or attitude that might indicate progress or setbacks. Phoenix had settled into his evening routine, no longer pacing his kennel with the nervous energy that had marked his first weeks at the facility. He acknowledged her presence with a brief tail wag, a small gesture that represented enormous progress for a dog who'd arrived too traumatized to make eye contact with humans. Scout greeted her with the enthusiasm that had replaced his former cowering, bringing her a rope toy and a clear invitation to play. Their relationship had evolved from patient rehabilitation to genuine friendship, with Scout serving as both success story and ongoing companion in her work with other traumatized animals. King, the former fighting dog, had graduated from rehabilitation to become a permanent resident and facility mascot, his gentle temperament serving as powerful evidence that dogs labeled as dangerous could be transformed through proper care. He followed Lily on her evening rounds, his presence calming to newer arrivals, who could sense his confidence and contentment. The tour ended at the newest addition to the facility, a memorial garden where small plaques honored the animals who'd passed through Sullivan Dog Training but hadn't survived to find permanent homes. Not every story had a happy ending, and Lily had learned to accept that some damage ran too deep for complete healing. But even those animals had experienced kindness and dignity in their final months, surrounded by people who valued their lives and mourned their passing. As she stood among the memorial stones, reading names and remembering individual personalities, Lily reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. The girl who'd fought dogs for scraps in frozen alleys had become someone who fought for dogs in courtrooms and conference halls, using her voice and expertise to advocate for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. The transformation hadn't erased her past or magically healed all the wounds that street life had inflicted. She still woke sometimes from nightmares about hunger and cold, still felt anxiety in crowds or when faced with unexpected changes. But those experiences had become sources of strength rather than shame, informing her work and deepening her empathy. For other survivors of trauma, Marcus found her in the garden as the last light faded from the Colorado sky, the memorial stones catching starlight like small beacons in the darkness. He'd aged during the years since their first meeting, but the lines around his eyes spoke of satisfaction rather than stress, the visible evidence of a life spent in meaningful work. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling onto the bench. beside the garden where they often met to discuss the day's developments and plan for future challenges. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Lily replied, gesturing toward the facility that sprawled around them. "Sometimes I have trouble believing this is real, that I actually belong here." Marcus followed her gaze across the kennels, where 47 dogs were settling into sleep with the confidence of creatures who knew they were safe. Belonging isn't something you achieve once and then keep forever. It's something you create daily through your choices and actions. You've earned your place here through every dog you've helped, every person you've taught, every time you've chosen to stay and fight instead of running when things got difficult. The words carried weight because they came from someone who'd witnessed her growth, who'd seen her evolve from desperate survivor to confident professional. Marcus had taken a considerable risk in offering her that first opportunity, betting on potential rather than proven track record. The success of that gamble had validated his belief that damaged creatures could heal when given proper support. "And time, what's next?" Lily asked a question that had become their evening ritual as they planned expansions, improvements, and new initiatives. "I've been thinking about that documentary project," Marcus replied. "The exposure it will bring could help us reach more people, maybe inspire other communities to develop similar programs. But it also means more scrutiny, more pressure to be perfect." Lily nodded, understanding the double-edged nature of success. Growth brought opportunities, but also challenges. The need to maintain their core mission while adapting to increased demands and expectations. They'd learn to navigate these tensions carefully, accepting beneficial changes while protecting the intimate, personal approach that made their work effective. "There's something else," Marcus continued, his tone shifting to the serious register he used for important announcements. "The board of directors has been discussing succession planning. I'm not getting any younger, and this place needs to have continuity beyond my involvement." The implication was clear, though Marcus was too diplomatic to state it directly. Lily had become the natural choice to eventually lead Sullivan dog training, her combination of practical expertise and public recognition, making her the logical successor to carry the mission forward. "I'm honored by the confidence," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility." "No one ever is," Marcus replied with a smile. "But readiness isn't the same as capability. You've already been leading in everything. But title, training staff, developing programs, representing our work to the professional community. The only thing that would change is the official recognition of what you're already doing." The conversation continued as they walked back toward the main building, discussing timelines, training needs, and the gradual transition that would ensure continuity of care for the animals and stability for the staff. It was a mark of how far Lily had come that such discussions felt like natural progression rather than impossible dreams. Later that night, alone in her apartment above the kennels, Lily stood at the window looking out over the facility that had become her world. The physical space had expanded dramatically since her arrival, but the essential character remained unchanged, a place where damaged creatures could find safety, healing, and hope for better futures. She thought about the dogs sleeping peacefully below, each one representing a small victory against the forces of abandonment, abuse, and indifference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new arrivals who would test her skills and patience. There would be setbacks, failures, heartbreak when some animals proved too damaged to save. But there would also be breakthroughs, adoptions, success stories. That justified every hour of patient work. The girl who'd once measured her life in terms of survival had found something infinitely more valuable, a purpose that used her hardest experiences to create healing for others. She'd learned that sometimes the deepest wounds, when properly tended, became sources of the greatest strength. As she prepared for sleep, Lily's last thought was of Phoenix, the German shepherd who'd taken his first tentative steps toward trust that morning. Tomorrow she would continue his rehabilitation, building on today's small victory with patient consistency, that would eventually teach him that safety was possible, that humans could be trusted, that damaged creatures could indeed learn to hope. Again, outside her window, the Colorado prairie stretched away toward distant mountains, vast and open and full of possibilities that a starving girl who'd fought dogs for scraps could never have imagined. But she was no longer that girl, and she was no longer fighting for scraps. She was fighting for something much more valuable, the belief that every creature, no matter how damaged, deserved a chance to heal and find their place in the world. Anniversary of her arrival at Sullivan Dog Training fell on a crisp October morning, exactly 18 months after she'd first walked through the facility's gates with nothing but desperate hope and a business card worn soft from handling. Lily hadn't planned any particular commemoration of the date, but as she moved through her morning routine, she found herself acutely aware of the transformations that had occurred in that span of time. The facility now housed 63 dogs, in various stages of rehabilitation, requiring a staff of 12 full-time employees and 27 regular volunteers. What had begun as Marcus's individual mission had evolved into a comprehensive animal welfare organization with programs spanning rescue, rehabilitation, training, education, and advocacy. The expansion had been carefully managed to preserve the personal touch that made their approach effective, but the scale of impact had grown exponentially. Lily's own transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The girl who'd arrived, with no official identity or legal documentation, now held certifications in animal behavior modification, trauma-informed care practices, and organizational leadership. She'd completed her GED through night classes, earned an associate degree in animal science through correspondence courses, and was halfway through a bachelor's program in nonprofit management that would prepare her for the leadership role everyone expected her to assume. The educational journey had been challenging in ways that street survival had never been. Academic work required different skills than reading pack dynamics or avoiding predators, demanding patience with abstract concepts, and comfort with formal evaluation that felt foreign after years of learning through immediate consequences. But Marcus had provided tutors when she struggled with mathematics. Sarah had helped with writing assignments, and the entire staff had celebrated each milestone as a collective victory. This morning brought a special visitor that reminded Lily of how far she'd traveled from her origins in the urban wilderness. Detective Maria Santos from the Denver Police Department had called the previous week, requesting a consultation on a cruelty case that involved animals seized from a fighting operation. The police had worked with Sullivan Dog Training before, recognizing that their expertise in trauma recovery often provided crucial evidence for prosecuting abusers. Detective Santos arrived with photographs and behavioral assessments that painted a grim picture of systematic abuse designed to transform naturally social animals into weapons. 17 dogs had been seized from the operation, most showing signs of physical and psychological damage that would require months or years of rehabilitation. Traditional shelters would have euthanized animals this severely traumatized, but recent legislative changes had created funding for specialized rehabilitation programs that offered alternatives to immediate destruction. "We need to know which of these animals might be salvageable," Detective Santos explained, spreading case files across the conference table. "The prosecutor wants expert testimony about their potential for recovery, both to support the cruelty charges and to justify the expense of rehabilitation rather than euthanasia." Lily studied the photographs with the clinical attention she'd learned to apply to such cases, looking past the visible injuries to read body language that revealed psychological state. Years of working with traumatized animals had taught her to identify signs of resilience versus indicators of damage too deep for recovery. The assessment required balancing realistic evaluation with hope, professional judgment with compassion. "This one," she said, pointing to a photograph of a scarred pit bull mix, "shows classic signs of learned helplessness, but maintains eye contact with the camera. That suggests the shutdown is protective rather than permanent. With proper rehabilitation, there's good potential for recovery. She continued through the files, providing detailed analysis of each animal's prospects based on subtle cues that most people would miss. Her recommendations would influence legal proceedings, determining whether the seized dogs would receive second chances or be humanely euthanized. The responsibility was sobering, but she'd learned to trust her judgment, while remaining honest about limitations and uncertainties. The consultation concluded with plans for Sullivan Dog Training to accept 5 of the most promising cases, animals whose rehabilitation would serve as evidence in the prosecution while providing them with genuine opportunities for healing. The arrangement reflected the facility's evolved role as both sanctuary and partner in the justice system's response to animal cruelty. After Detective Santos departed, Lily found herself walking through the kennels with renewed appreciation for the stability and safety that surrounded her. Every dog in their care had access to medical treatment, nutritious food, comfortable shelter, and patient human attention luxuries that were invisible until you'd experienced their absence. The contrast with her own early days on the streets was stark enough to make her pause in gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. The afternoon brought a different kind of professional development, a video conference with representatives from 3 international animal welfare organizations who were interested in adapting Sullivan Dog Training's rehabilitation model for their own regions. The facility's success had attracted attention far beyond Colorado, inspiring similar programs in communities that struggled with overpopulation, abuse, and limited resources for addressing animal welfare issues. Dr. Catherine Reed, calling from Edinburgh, Scotland, described the challenges facing Scottish animal shelters with limited space and funding for behavioral rehabilitation. We're seeing increasing numbers of animals with trauma-related behavioral issues, but we lack the expertise to address them effectively. Most end up being euthanized, despite having potential for recovery with proper treatment. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering practical details of program implementation, staff training requirements, funding strategies, and adaptation to different cultural contexts. Lily found herself explaining concepts she'd once struggled to understand, translating her experiential knowledge into frameworks that could be replicated by others. The key insight, she explained to the international audience, is that trauma recovery follows predictable patterns regardless of species. Whether you're working with animals or humans, the process requires safety, patience, consistency, and respect for individual pacing. You can't force healing, but you can create conditions that make it possible. The principles she articulated had been hard-won through her own journey from street survival to professional competence. Understanding trauma from the inside had given her insights that purely academic training might have missed, allowing her to recognize subtle signs of progress or setback that others overlooked. Following the international consultation, Lily spent time with the newest additions to their rehabilitation program. 3 puppies, approximately 8 weeks old, had been seized from a hoarding situation where they'd received minimal human contact and no socialization with the outside world. Unlike the adult dogs who arrived with specific traumas to overcome, these puppies faced the challenge of learning basic trust and social skills during their critical developmental period. Working with the puppies required different techniques than adult rehabilitation, focusing on positive exposure to normal life experiences rather than recovery from abuse. Lily introduced them gradually to household sounds, different surfaces and textures, gentle handling that taught them human touch could be pleasant rather than threatening. The work was simultaneously easier and more complex than adult trauma. Recovery easier because young minds were more adaptable, more complex because proper socialization required exposing them to controlled challenges that built confidence without overwhelming their capacity to cope. "This little girl shows promise," Lily told Jessica, the junior trainer who was learning puppy socialization techniques. The smallest of the three puppies, a mixed breed with distinctive markings, had begun seeking human attention rather than avoiding it. She's starting to understand that people are sources of comfort rather than threat. That's the foundation for everything else we'll teach her. Jessica documented the puppy's progress in detailed notes that would become part of her permanent record, tracking behavioral development that would help determine her placement needs when she was ready for adoption. The comprehensive record keeping had become standard practice at Sullivan Dog Training, providing data that supported their success claims while helping adopting families understand their new pets. Backgrounds and Needs. Evening brought Lily's weekly meeting with the facility's board of directors, a group of community leaders, animal welfare advocates, and financial supporters who provided oversight and strategic guidance for the organization's continued growth. Tonight's agenda included budget approval for the next fiscal year, review of expansion proposals, and discussion of a major gift offer that could transform their capacity, but came with conditions that required careful consideration. The Hartman Foundation, established by a tech entrepreneur whose own rescue dog had come from Sullivan Dog Training, had offered a $2.3 million grant to construct a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center that would triple their capacity. The facility would include specialized treatment areas for different types of trauma, research laboratories for studying animal behavior, and residential accommodations for visiting professionals who wanted to learn their techniques. But the grant came with requirements that sparked debate among board members. The foundation wanted Sullivan Dog Training to become a research institution, documenting their methods with scientific rigor that could support evidence-based practices throughout the animal welfare field. This would mean additional staffing, formal research protocols, and a level of academic oversight that might compromise the intimate, intuitive approach that made their current work effective. We risk losing our soul in pursuit of our mission, argued board member Patricia Williams, a retired veterinarian who'd supported the facility since its early days. What makes this place special is the personal relationships, the individual attention, the willingness to try unconventional approaches when standard methods fail. Institutionalizing that could destroy the very qualities that create success. Lily found herself in the position of moderating between competing visions of the organization's future, using diplomatic skills she'd never imagined needing when she first arrived as a desperate teenager. The responsibility felt surreal. Someone who'd once been grateful for any form of shelter was now helping to decide the strategic direction of a multi-million-dollar organization. Maybe the question isn't whether to pursue research, she suggested during a break in the heated discussion, but how to conduct research that strengthens rather than compromises our core work. We could design studies that document what we're already doing rather than forcing us to change our approach to fit academic models. The compromise she proposed involved accepting the Hartman Foundation grant while maintaining control over research, priorities, and methodologies. Sullivan Dog Training would document their techniques and outcomes with scientific rigor, but the research would serve their mission rather than directing it. The arrangement would provide credible evidence for their approaches, while preserving the flexibility that made innovation possible. Board approval came after another hour of discussion, with the understanding that implementation would be gradual and carefully monitored to ensure it enhanced rather than hindered their animal care mission. Lily's role in reaching consensus had demonstrated leadership skills that formalized her status as Marcus's designated successor, though the transition timeline remained flexible based on her continued education and development. The board meeting concluded with review of adoption statistics that validated their rehabilitation approach. Of the 347 animals placed in homes over the past 18 months, only 12 had been returned due to behavioral issues that couldn't be resolved through follow-up support. The 96.5% success rate exceeded industry standards and provided compelling evidence that investment in rehabilitation produced better outcomes than immediate euthanasia for difficult cases. But statistics couldn't capture the individual stories that gave meaning to their work. Lily thought of families like the Martinezes, whose daughter's autism symptoms had improved dramatically through her relationship with Bella. She remembered Marcus Thornton, the elderly widower whose depression had lifted when he adopted Chester, the arthritic golden retriever who'd needed a quiet home and patient care. Each successful placement represented multiple lives transformed through the careful matching of healed animals with families who could appreciate their unique qualities. Late that evening, Lily made her customary rounds through the kennels, checking on animals who required special attention and ensuring that all were comfortable for the night. The routine had become her version of meditation, a quiet time for reflection and connection with the creatures whose care had become her life's work. Phoenix, the German shepherd who'd been her morning training partner 6 months earlier, greeted her with confident affection that would have been unimaginable during his early weeks at the facility. His transformation from cowering victim to stable companion had occurred gradually, through thousands of small interactions that rebuilt his capacity for trust. Now he served as a training assistant himself, helping newer arrivals learn that humans could be reliable sources of care and comfort. In the newer wing of the facility, the 5 dogs from the fighting ring were beginning their own journeys toward rehabilitation. 2 showed promising signs of responsiveness to gentle treatment, while 3 remained too traumatized for significant human interaction. The recovery process would be measured in months rather than weeks, requiring patience and persistence that not every organization could provide. Lily paused at the kennel housing the most severely damaged of the seized dogs, a Staffordshire Terrier mix whose scarred body told stories of systematic abuse. The dog hadn't made eye contact with humans since his arrival, spending his days pressed against the back wall of his enclosure in a futile attempt to disappear. Professional ethics required honest assessment of recovery prospects, but Lily had learned to balance realism with hope, giving damaged creatures time to reveal their potential before making final judgments about their futures. The memorial garden had grown since her early days at the facility, with new plaques honoring animals who'd passed through their care but hadn't survived to find permanent homes. Not every story ended in successful adoption, and Lily had learned to accept that some damage ran too deep for complete healing. But even those animals had experienced dignity and compassion in their final weeks, surrounded by people who valued their lives and mourned their passing. Standing among the memorial stones, reading names she remembered and stories she'd helped write, Lily reflected on the fundamental transformation that had occurred in her understanding of success and failure. Street life had taught her to measure victories in terms of immediate survival, finding food, avoiding danger, lasting until tomorrow. Professional animal care had introduced her to longer timelines and more complex definitions of achievement. Some victories were dramatic, aggressive dogs learning to trust, traumatized puppies discovering that humans could be safe. Others were subtler, small improvements in quality of life for animals who would never be completely healed, peaceful endings for creatures whose damage was too extensive for recovery. Learning to value these quieter successes had been part of her own emotional rehabilitation, accepting that healing came in many forms, and that not every battle could be won completely. The night sky above the Colorado prairie was brilliant with stars, unpolluted by the urban light that had obscured them during her months on the city streets. Lily had learned to read weather patterns in these same constellations, to find direction when human landmarks failed, to take comfort in constants that remained stable when everything else was changing. Now those same stars witnessed a different kind of navigation, the careful charting of courses toward healing, and hope for creatures who'd lost faith in both. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new arrivals who would test her skills and patience. There would be setbacks, failures, moments when the weight of accumulated trauma seemed too heavy for any individual to bear. But there would also be breakthroughs, adoptions, success stories that justified every hour of patient work and every resource invested in the belief that damaged creatures could learn to trust again. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Lily carried with her the quiet satisfaction of a day spent in meaningful work, surrounded by evidence that transformation was possible for even the most damaged souls. The girl who'd once fought dogs for scraps had found something infinitely more valuable, a purpose that used her hardest experiences to create healing for others. Proof that sometimes the deepest wounds, when properly tended, became sources of the greatest strength. 3 days later, Lily received a phone call that would test everything she'd learned about courage, trust, and the willingness to extend help to those who needed it most. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Thompson, a social worker from Denver's Department of Human Services, and her request was unlike anything Sullivan Dog Training had encountered before. "We have a situation involving a 13-year-old girl," Rebecca explained, her voice carrying the careful professional tone that social workers used when discussing sensitive cases. "She was removed from a neglect situation 6 months ago and has been through 4 different foster placements. The problem is that she refuses to engage with humans, but has shown remarkable connection with animals. We're wondering if you might consider allowing her to volunteer at your facility as part of her therapy." The request struck Lily with unexpected force, triggering memories of her own desperate teenage years and the foster care system that had failed to provide the stability she'd needed. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Another damaged girl who'd learned to trust animals more readily than humans, another young person whose traditional support systems had proved inadequate for her particular wounds. "Tell me more about her background," Lily said, settling into her office chair and reaching for a notepad to document the details. Rebecca's account painted a familiar picture of systemic failure and accumulated trauma. Emma Rodriguez had been living with her grandmother after her parents' deaths in a car accident, but the elderly woman's declining health had created conditions that constituted neglect. By the time authorities intervened, Emma had been caring for herself and several stray animals in a house without heat or regular food, developing survival skills that made her resistant to traditional therapeutic approaches. "She's incredibly intelligent," Rebecca continued, "but she won't engage in talk therapy or group sessions. The only time she shows any emotional response is when she's interacting with animals. Her current foster family has a dog, and that's the only relationship she's formed since entering care." Lily found herself thinking of Phoenix Scout and the dozens of other animals who'd required patience and indirect approaches before they could accept human care. Traditional therapy assumed willingness to engage, but some trauma ran too deep for conventional intervention. Sometimes healing required different environments, different relationships, different ways of building trust. What would her involvement look like? Lily asked, already formulating possibilities in her mind. "Initially, just a few hours a week, supervised by both our staff and yours. We'd want to see if working with animals in recovery might help her process her own experiences. There's growing research suggesting that caring for others can be therapeutic for trauma survivors." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering liability concerns, supervision requirements, and the careful protocols that would govern Emma's participation. By the end of the call, Lily had committed to a trial period that would begin the following week. Pending approval from Marcus and the board of directors, Marcus's response was immediate and enthusiastic when Lily presented the proposal during their evening planning session. "It makes perfect sense," he said, reviewing the documentation Rebecca had provided. "We've always said that healing happens through relationship and meaningful work. If this girl has a natural affinity for animals, maybe helping them recover will help her process her own trauma." The board's approval came with careful conditions designed to protect both Emma and the facility. Professional supervision would be provided jointly by Rebecca Thompson and Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who specialized in animal-assisted therapy. Emma's involvement would focus on basic care tasks rather than direct training, ensuring she could contribute meaningfully without taking on responsibilities beyond her developmental capacity. Lily spent the weekend preparing for Emma's arrival, selecting animals who would be appropriate for a young volunteer to work with and designing tasks that would be engaging without being overwhelming. She chose dogs in the middle stages of rehabilitation, stable enough to be safe around children, but still making visible progress that would demonstrate the value of patient care. Emma Rodriguez arrived on Monday morning, accompanied by Rebecca Thompson and Dr. Foster, a small figure whose defensive posture reminded Lily painfully of her own early days at the facility. The 13-year-old had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothing that prioritized function over appearance. Her eyes constantly scanned the environment, cataloging escape routes and potential threats with the hypervigilance that Lily recognized as a survival adaptation. "This is a lot of dogs," Emma said quietly, her first words since entering the facility. 63 at the moment," Lily replied, matching Emma's subdued tone. "Each one has their own story, their own personality, their own way of healing. Would you like to meet a few of them?" The introduction process was carefully orchestrated, beginning with Scout, whose gentle temperament and remarkable recovery story made him an ideal ambassador for the healing process. Emma approached his kennel with the cautious respect of someone who understood that trust had to be earned rather than assumed. Scout responded to Emma's presence with interested attention, but without the overwhelming enthusiasm that might have startled a nervous newcomer. His calm confidence seemed to communicate that this new person might be worth knowing, that humans could indeed be safe and predictable. "He's beautiful," Emma said, extending her hand slowly for Scout to investigate. "What happened to him?" Lily shared Scout's story, the abandonment, the months of fearful cowering, the gradual process of learning to trust again. She watched Emma's face as she listened, noting the way the girl's expression softened as she recognized parallels to her own experience of loss and displacement. "How long did it take?" Emma asked, "for him to stop being scared?" "About 6 months for major progress," Lily replied honestly. "But healing isn't really a destination you reach, it's more like a direction you choose to keep moving in." Scout still has days when he's more cautious than others, but he's learned that setbacks don't erase progress. The wisdom in those words applied equally to human and animal recovery, and Lily suspected Emma understood the broader implications, even if she wasn't ready to articulate them. Sometimes the most powerful therapeutic insights came through metaphor and parallel experience, rather than direct confrontation with painful truths. Emma's first official task involved helping to prepare food for the dogs requiring special diets, measuring portions and organizing medications under Sarah's careful supervision. The work was routine but meaningful, requiring attention to detail while providing immediate evidence that her contributions mattered to the animal's well-being. "Each dog gets exactly what they need," Sarah explained as Emma carefully measured medication for Chester, the arthritic golden retriever. "Too little and they don't get better. Too much and it could hurt them. Finding the right balance takes patience and observation." The lesson extended beyond medication management, touching on themes of care, consistency, and the importance of individual attention that Emma was beginning to experience in her own life. Working with animals who required specialized care provided concrete examples of how damaged creatures could thrive when their specific needs were understood and addressed. By the end of her first day, Emma had interacted with 8 different dogs, each encounter building her confidence while demonstrating the variety of personalities and recovery trajectories represented within the facility. She showed particular interest in the newer arrivals, animals still in the early stages of rehabilitation who hadn't yet learned to trust their safety. "This one reminds me of how I felt when I first got to my foster home," Emma told Dr. Foster, pointing to a recently arrived beagle mix who spent most of his time pressed against the back wall of his kennel. Like everyone was trying to help, but I wasn't sure if I could believe them. The observation demonstrated exactly the kind of therapeutic insight that Dr. Foster had hoped to facilitate through Emma's involvement with the facility. By caring for animals in recovery, Emma was developing vocabulary and perspective for understanding her own healing process. Emma's second week brought increased responsibility and deepening relationships with specific animals, who seemed to respond particularly well to her presence. She gravitated toward the dogs with the most challenging backgrounds, perhaps recognizing kindred spirits in creatures who'd learned that safety was temporary and trust was dangerous. Working with Ranger, a German Shepherd mix seized from an abusive situation, Emma demonstrated an intuitive understanding of trauma responses that impressed even Lily's experienced eye. She never pushed for interaction, instead sitting quietly near his kennel and reading aloud from books about animal behavior, creating a calm presence that gradually convinced Ranger she posed no threat. "You're doing exactly what he needs," Lily told Emma during one of their debriefing sessions. Trauma recovery can't be rushed, but it can be supported by people who understand that healing happens at its own pace. Emma nodded, then surprised everyone by sharing her own insight. "Sometimes when adults try to make me feel better, it feels like they're really trying to make themselves feel better. But the dogs don't need me to be anything except patient and honest." The comment revealed a sophisticated understanding of therapeutic dynamics that many adult trauma survivors never developed. Emma was learning to differentiate between help that served the helper versus care that truly benefited the recipient, a distinction that would serve her well in navigating her own recovery relationships. As autumn progressed into winter, Emma's involvement with Sullivan dog training evolved from experimental therapy into genuine partnership. She worked 3 afternoons a week, contributing meaningful labor while processing her own experiences through parallel observation of animal recovery. Her foster placement had stabilized, and her academic performance had improved dramatically. As she found purpose and connection through her work with traumatized animals, the success of Emma's integration prompted discussions about expanding the program to include other young people whose traditional therapy approaches had proved inadequate. Dr. Foster began developing protocols for animal-assisted healing that could serve adolescents who'd experienced trauma, neglect, or systemic failure of human support systems. "We're seeing remarkable results," Dr. Foster reported during a presentation to the board of directors. "Emma's progress in 4 months has exceeded what we typically see in a year of conventional therapy. There's something powerful about caring for others who've experienced similar trauma. It provides purpose, builds empathy, and creates hope that healing is possible." The presentation included data on Emma's improved academic performance, increased social engagement, and decreased anxiety symptoms. But more compelling than statistics were the qualitative changes, visible to anyone who spent time with her: the growing confidence, the willingness to share insights about her experience, the genuine affection she developed for the animals. In her care, Lily often found herself reflecting on the circular nature of healing represented by Emma's journey. The girl who'd arrived as a recipient of therapeutic services had become a provider of care for creatures who needed exactly the kind of patient, trauma-informed attention she was learning to give. The relationship was mutually beneficial, with Emma's healing supporting animal recovery, while animal recovery facilitated Emma's growth. Winter brought challenges that tested everyone's resilience, but they also provided opportunities for Emma to demonstrate the leadership skills she was developing through her work at the facility. When a severe storm knocked out power for 3 days, Emma worked alongside the regular staff to ensure animal care continued without interruption, showing initiative and responsibility that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. She's becoming someone who steps toward problems rather than away from them, Rebecca Thompson observed during one of the quarterly reviews that monitored Emma's progress. That's a fundamental shift in how she sees herself and her relationship to the world. The observation captured the essence of what Lily had learned about trauma recovery through her own journey and her work with damaged animals. Healing wasn't about returning to some previous state of innocence or safety. It was about developing new capacities for engagement, contribution, and hope despite the wounds that would always be part of personal history. As spring arrived and marked the first anniversary of Emma's involvement with Sullivan dog training, the facility prepared for a celebration that would honor both human and animal recoveries achieved over the past year. The event would showcase successful adoptions, highlight innovative programs, and demonstrate the expanding impact of their trauma-informed approach to healing. Emma had volunteered to help coordinate the celebration, taking responsibility for creating presentations about the dogs she'd worked with most closely. Her enthusiasm for the project reflected genuine pride in their shared accomplishments, evidence of self-esteem rebuilt through meaningful contribution to others' well-being. I want people to understand that healing isn't just about forgetting bad things, Emma explained while working on her presentation materials. It's about learning that good things are possible too, even after terrible things happen. The wisdom in her words reflected months of patient learning, not just about animal behavior, but about the fundamental nature of recovery and resilience. Emma had become living proof that damaged young people, like traumatized animals, could learn to trust again when provided with appropriate support, meaningful work, and time to heal at their own pace. In the morning, the work would continue both the patient rehabilitation of damaged animals and the careful nurturing of human healing that made such work possible. But tonight, as Lily prepared for sleep in her apartment above the kennels, she felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that circles of healing were expanding beyond anything she could have imagined when she first fought dogs for scraps in frozen alleys. The girl who'd learned to survive alone had found purpose in creating safety for others. The teenager who'd trusted no one had become someone others could trust. And somewhere in the kennels below, animals who'd given up hope were learning to believe in tomorrow because people who understood their pain had chosen to invest in their healing. Recovery was possible. Trust could be rebuilt. And sometimes, the most wounded souls became the most powerful healers when given the chance to serve something larger than their own survival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.